I'm going to be talking to John Moura, who is the Director of Reliability Assessment for the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation. He's based in Atlanta, Georgia, and we're going to be talking about reserve margins for Ontario. So welcome to the interview, John.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Well, look, let's start with the real basics here. What is NERC?
Great. Well, NERC's an interesting organization. We've been around for over 50 years, and we're an international nonprofit organization with a mission to preserve and ensure reliability of the bulk power system across all of North America. What many people don't know is the electricity grid across North America is interconnected. It's one large machine. Well, it's actually four large machines. There's actually four different interconnections across North America. And what NERC does is develop reliability standards, mandatory and enforceable rules of the road, you might say, in how all of these companies, the transmission operators, the generator owners, the system operators, how they all work together to ensure the reliability of the bulk power system remains as reliable as it always has been. And so NERC coordinates the efforts of all of our stakeholders, which includes all users, owners, and operators of the bulk power system. And we write and develop those standards. In North America, in each of the provinces in Canada, as well as the federal United States, we work with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to enforce those standards. We are the designated electricity reliability organization as part of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. After we became that entity, we sought out similar recognition in each of the provinces, and all of our standards are recognized now as enforceable. In addition to the standards, the rules, the must-dos, we also do reliability assessments. That's kind of the other thing we do. And we've been doing that for 50 years, where we both look at past performance, how the grid has performed, but also how the grid is expected to perform in the future.
Now, this has become a particularly important issue as we move to renewable energy, intermittent energy, and we've seen outages in California last summer in August during the heat wave. We've seen it again in Texas in February with the blizzard there. Of course, it's not all related to renewables. Don't want to leave that impression. But one thing that is an important part of your assessment is reserve margin. And could you tell us what a reserve margin is, please?
Yeah, as part of our assessments, and that part has become more important than ever as the resource mix has changed, as we've retired coal units and we've brought on more renewables. The measure in which we look at reliability is one of the many measures is called reserve margins. And basically what that is we look at one of the most stressful days on the system. In Ontario, it actually could be a cold winter day, but more recently it's been your summer peaks. And then we measure how much capacity, or all generation resources, demand side resources, we measure how much capacity is out there to determine the buffer in which it exists. We like to keep a good amount of reserves. That might be anywhere between 12%, sometimes as much as 18%. But as the system changes, as we introduce more variable resources, solar and wind resources, our reserve margins will tend to increase. And I think that some of the changes that we're seeing going on in terms of when we're looking at the future reserve margins, what's needed to maintain reliability.
Well, let's talk about Ontario. Now, I'm looking at a chart of reserve margins across the United States and Canada. And so Texas and California have a higher reserve margin than Ontario, which is the lowest in North America by a long shot. And I'm hoping you can explain for me why Ontario has such a low reserve margin.
Yeah, Ontario does have a low reserve margin, and depending on which year you're looking at, because what we do with our reliability assessments, we look at 10 years. We look at a long-term assessment. We also do short-term assessments. Our most recent summer reliability assessment that looks at the reserve margins for the upcoming summer show adequate resources in Ontario. So in the short term, there is sufficient margin. And so I think that's a good thing. In the long term, we do see some insufficiencies, and that's really just because a lot of these resources have retired. We have a growth in electricity use. We have more uncertainty because a larger part of the resource mix is wind and solar, and so we need to account for that certainty with larger margins. And so what the forward capacity market does in Ontario is help achieve that. And what we're seeing is a slight deficit. But what the good news is we see that in the future. So we have some time to be able to achieve that, to make sure we secure that capacity by the time that future date comes.
But I guess we should add that a lot of the uncertainty comes from the retirement of the Pickering nuclear plant, and 2 other nuclear plants will be down for refurbishment during at least part of the 2020s and into the early 2030s. There is gas plant capacity, surplus capacity now, but the experts that I've talked to worry that that's it's a contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, which is very controversial in Ontario right now. And also, is it enough? And so you've determined, NERC has determined that it is a little, looking out, say, to 2025 or later, there isn't enough margin there. What then happens, John? Does the independent system operator in Ontario have to take action? Is that a required thing, or is this you're giving them advice and you hope that they take action?
It's a signal of a functioning market. And in the wholesale electricity market that's run in Ontario, what should happen now is the prices should, or other incentives should respond accordingly, as long as that reliability signal has been sent. And I think that's what this assessment does, as well as the ISO's own long-term planning that shows the deficit. Now the market can respond to that. But it is important about the outages and the maintenance that's required around the nuclear plants. We need those margins so we can have flexibility, so that we can take outages when necessary and still be able to serve demand. We're going to need that flexibility. So sometimes even being right at the margin isn't sufficient enough. And one thing that's really important, I think, that's important about the margin, it's the minimum. You really never want to be under that target reserve margin that's established by the planners. And that's what should be planned. And that's how the market should be able to respond to that in the future.
Final question for you, John. Is the reserve margin that Ontario has looking out, 2025-ish and beyond, how close is it to being, I don't know, I don't have the technical term, so I'm going to say dangerously close to being in a situation where you might have brownouts, blackouts, rolling outages, those sorts of things? Is this, should Ontario be really concerned about that? Or is this, on a scale of 1 to 10, is it a 1 or is it a 10 or somewhere in between?
Yeah, well, I think what's really important to have, that discussion, is understanding the difference between what we would consider a blackout that's large, cascading, causes large instability, affects a widespread area. We are not concerned with the risk of that. We have our reliability standards that protect that, and the system operators do a fine job at maintaining the stability and security of the system. And so what we are talking about is, on occasion, when extreme weather occurs, which seems to affect the grid more often, on those occasions, a small fraction of the load may be forced to undergo rotating outage. And so while the entire system shows this deficit from a reserve margin perspective, it's really under these extreme conditions that load might not be served for a very small fraction of the area. That's not a silver lining. That is not something that is acceptable. But I wanted to put it in perspective that this is not one of these large, widespread outage, and absolutely nothing close to what we observed in Texas in the mid-south of the country during the winter.
John, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Great. Thank you so much for being